The snow fell in thick curtains outside the office window, each flake catching the glow of the Christmas lights strung across downtown. Richard Brennan stood at his desk, his hand resting on the termination letter he'd just signed. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Through the glass wall of his corner office, he could see Margaret Chen at her cubicle, wrapping a small present in cheerful paper covered with reindeer. She worked in accounting, had been with the company for 8 years, and he knew, because he'd signed off on it, that she was being let go in exactly 10 minutes. Christmas Eve. The timing wasn't his choice. Corporate had mandated the layoffs before year-end, but that didn't stop the uncomfortable weight settling in his chest. He watched her tie a crooked bow on the gift, her movements careful and practiced, and something in him wondered if he'd remember this moment longer than he wanted to. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Margaret had come to Brennan Industries fresh out of community college, a single mother with 2 kids, and a determination that impressed even the toughest managers. Richard remembered interviewing her years ago, back when he still conducted some of the hiring himself. She'd been nervous, her resume crumpled slightly at the edges from being carried in her purse. But when she talked about her children, Emma, who was 5 then, and little Danny, barely 3, her whole face changed. She didn't make excuses about needing flexible hours or having to miss work when they were sick. She simply said, "I'll work harder than anyone you've ever hired, and I'll prove it every single day." And she had. The company had grown since then. Richard's father had started Brennan Industries in a garage 40 years ago, building custom electronics components. By the time Richard took over, they'd expanded into commercial contracts, government bids, high-stakes manufacturing. The warm family feel his father had cultivated got replaced by quarterly earnings calls and efficiency metrics. Richard told himself it was necessary, that you couldn't compete in the modern market with handshakes and loyalty alone. But lately, especially in quiet moments like this, he wasn't so sure. Margaret never complained. She arrived early, stayed late when projects demanded it, and had a reputation for catching errors that would have cost the company thousands. Other employees came to her with questions because she knew the systems better than people who'd been there twice as long. Richard had seen her eating lunch at her desk most days, usually something simple from home, a sandwich, an apple, a thermos of soup. He'd overheard her once on the phone during a break, telling Emma that yes, they'd have a good Christmas. Not to worry, Mama had it handled. The layoffs had been announced to management 2 weeks ago. 15 positions across 3 departments, all determined by an algorithm that weighed performance against salary costs and future projections. Margaret's name appeared on the list, and Richard had stared at it for a long time. The numbers said she cost more than a newer hire would, that her role could be redistributed. The numbers didn't know about Emma and Danny. The numbers didn't care that Christmas was 10 days away. He'd try to argue. During the executive meeting, he'd pointed out her error rate, her reliability, the institutional knowledge she carried. But the CFO, a man named Garrett who'd never worked anywhere longer than 3 years, had been unmoved. "Sentiment doesn't pay dividends, Richard. Your father built this company on hard work, and hard choices are part of that legacy." Richard had wanted to say his father would have found another way, but the words stuck in his throat, maybe because he wasn't sure they were true anymore. The HR director, Patricia, appeared at his office door right on schedule. She was good at her job in the way that meant she could deliver bad news without flinching, a skill Richard had once admired and now found unsettling. "Ready?" she asked, holding her own folder of documents. Richard nodded, picking up the termination letter. His hands were steady. They'd done this before, twice this year already, though never right before Christmas. They walked across the office floor together. A few people glanced up, then quickly looked away. Word had spread that layoffs were happening today, and everyone knew that walk, that purposeful stride toward someone's desk. Margaret noticed them coming. Richard saw her shoulders tense slightly, saw her hands still on the keyboard. When they reached her cubicle, she'd already closed the personal photos on her screen, the ones of Emma and Danny at the beach last summer, all 3 of them squinting into the sun and grinning. "Margaret," Patricia began, her voice professionally, sympathetic. "Could you come with us to the conference room, please?" Margaret stood slowly. She didn't ask why. She didn't protest. She just picked up her phone and followed them, her steps quiet on the carpet. Behind them, the office had gone conspicuously silent, everyone pretending to work while watching from the corners of their eyes. In the conference room, Patricia did most of the talking. Budget restructuring, difficult decisions, nothing personal, 2 weeks severance and continued health insurance through the end of January. Margaret sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. Richard watched her face, looking for anger or tears, but she simply nodded at the appropriate moments. When Patricia slid the papers across the table for her signature, Margaret picked up the pen without hesitation. "I understand," she said quietly. "May I collect my things?" "Of course," Patricia replied. "Take your time." But Margaret didn't take her time. She returned to her cubicle, pulled a small cardboard box from under her desk, as if she'd known, as if she'd prepared, and began placing items inside. The coffee mug Emma had painted in art class, a framed photo, the small cactus Danny had given her for Mother's Day because he'd spent his allowance on it. It took her less than 10 minutes. When she walked toward the elevator, the wrapped present, the one with the crooked bow, sat abandoned on her desk. Richard stood at his office window and watched her car pull out of the parking lot, its taillights disappearing into the swirling snow. Richard went home that evening to his apartment in the high-rise downtown, the kind of place with floor-to-ceiling, windows and furniture that looked expensive because it was. He heated up leftover takeout and tried to watch television, but nothing held his attention. His phone sat on the coffee table, silent. Most of his friends from college had families now, houses in the suburbs, children who believed in Santa Claus. Richard had the company. It had always seemed like enough. He thought about Margaret Chen more than he wanted to. Wondered if she'd told her kids yet. Wondered what she'd say to them. The severance was fair by corporate standards. 2 weeks. Pay, a neutral reference letter, but he knew it wouldn't go far. Not with rent and groceries and Christmas presents already purchased, hidden away somewhere, waiting to be wrapped and placed under a tree. On Christmas morning, Richard woke up alone. He made coffee, worked for a few hours on his laptop, and around noon decided to drive to his father's grave. It had become a tradition of sorts, visiting on holidays. His father had died 3 years ago, a heart attack that came too suddenly, before Richard could ask the questions he should have asked, before he could figure out if the choices he was making were the ones his father would have respected. The cemetery was quiet, covered in fresh snow that made everything look clean and peaceful. Richard brushed off the headstone and stood there, hands in his pockets, breath fogging in the cold air. "I'm doing my best, Dad," he said softly. "I'm trying to keep it all running." The stone offered no answers, just his father's name and dates, and the inscription his mother had chosen. A man who built with his hands and led with his heart. On his way home, Richard took a different route, one that led through the older neighborhood near the industrial district. He wasn't sure why he turned down Margaret Street. He'd only seen her address on the termination paperwork. But he found himself slowing as he passed her building. It was a small apartment complex, the kind with exterior stairs and laundry rooms in the basement. Children's bikes leaned against the railing, and Christmas decorations hung in windows, some elaborate, some just strings of lights that blinked on and off. He almost drove past. But then he saw them. 2 children stood on the sidewalk in front of the building, both bundled in winter coats that looked slightly too big. The girl was older, maybe 13 now, with her mother's straight dark hair pulled into a ponytail. The boy was smaller, perhaps 9 or 10, wearing a bright red scarf wrapped several times around his neck. They were setting up a small folding table, the kind you'd use for a yard sale. On it, they'd placed a handwritten sign. Richard pulled over to the curb, far enough away that they wouldn't notice him immediately. He could read the sign from where he sat. It was written in marker on cardboard, the letters careful and neat. Baked goods for sale, money for Mom's groceries. The table held maybe a dozen items. Cookies wrapped in plastic wrap, what looked like banana bread, sliced and arranged on paper plates. A few cupcakes with homemade frosting. Prices were listed next to each item. 50 cents for cookies, $1 for bread, $2 for cupcakes. Emma, it had to be Emma, kept straightening the sign, adjusting it so it caught the light better. Danny stood beside her, stamping his feet against the cold, his breath creating small clouds. They'd been out there for 20 minutes when the first customer appeared. An elderly woman from the building next door bought 2 slices of banana bread. Emma counted the change twice before putting it in a small jar, and Danny grinned like they'd just made a fortune. A man jogging past stopped and bought cookies. Then a couple walking their dog. Each time money went into the jar, both children's faces lit up with something that made Richard's chest tighten. He sat in his warm car and watched these kids, these children who should have been inside playing with Christmas presents, standing in the cold trying to sell baked goods so their mother could buy groceries. Because he'd fired her. Because the algorithm said it made sense. Because quarterly earnings mattered more than the fact that Margaret Chen had worked her heart out for 8 years and still ended up here, with her children trying to fix what he'd broken. A woman came out of the apartment building, Margaret, carrying a tray of more cookies. When she saw the table, saw her children standing there in the cold, she stopped completely. Richard watched her face cycle through confusion, then understanding, then something that looked like her heart breaking and mending at the same time. She set down the tray and pulled both kids into a hug, holding them tight, and Richard could see her shoulders shaking even from a distance. Emma was crying too, but smiling through it. "We wanted to help," she said, loud enough that Richard could hear through his partially open window. "We can't let you worry alone, Mom." Margaret wiped her eyes, laughed a little, then hugged them again. She didn't tell them to go inside. She didn't tell them it wasn't their responsibility. She just stood there with them, helping to arrange the cookies, adjusting the sign, being together. Richard's hands gripped the steering wheel. He thought about his apartment, his expensive furniture, his father's gravestone, and the empty silence of his Christmas day. He thought about the termination letter he'd signed without fighting hard enough. He thought about what his father would say if he could see this moment, see what Richard's necessary decisions had created. If this moment touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up. The sky was growing darker now, the afternoon fading into evening. Emma and Danny kept their small vigil at the table, their determination unwavering despite the cold. And Richard Brennan, CEO of Brennan Industries, sat in his car and realized something had broken inside him that he didn't know how to fix. Richard didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, seeing Emma's careful handwriting on that cardboard sign, seeing Danny's red scarf, seeing Margaret's face when she understood what her children had done. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in that conference room, watching Margaret sign her termination papers with steady hands because she had no other choice. The company would open again after the holiday weekend. He'd go back to his office, review the fourth quarter numbers, attend meetings where people congratulated him on the successful cost-cutting measures. Life would continue exactly as it had, except somewhere in the city. Margaret Chen would be searching job listings and stretching her severance pay and trying to figure out how to tell her kids they might need to move somewhere cheaper. He got up at 4 in the A. Morning and made coffee he didn't drink. Through his window, the city sparkled with lights, beautiful and cold and indifferent. Richard had grown up in this city. His father had built a business here, had employed people who became friends, who came to backyard barbecues and sent Christmas cards long after they'd retired. When had that stopped? When had the company become just numbers and efficiency metrics and quarterly projections? He pulled out his laptop and started searching. It took him 20 minutes to find what he was looking for. Old employee directories, back when his father kept detailed records of every person who worked at Brennan Industries. There it was, Margaret Chen's original job application from 8 years ago, scanned into the system. He read through it again, this time really reading it. She'd listed her children's ages, had written in the margin that she could start immediately, that she'd never miss a deadline. Under the question about career goals, she'd written something that caught in his throat. To provide a stable life for my family and contribute meaningfully to an organization I can be proud of. To be proud of. When was the last time Richard had thought about whether his employees were proud to work at Brennan Industries? He thought about calling Patricia, the HR director, but it was still dark outside and even he wasn't that desperate yet. Instead, he opened the company's financial reports, the real ones, not the sanitized versions presented to the board. He went through every line item, every projection, every assumption that had led to those 15 layoffs. It took him 3 hours, working methodically, questioning every number. And then he found it. The algorithm had made assumptions about future contract values that were, he realized, overly conservative. One of their major clients had verbally committed to a renewal that hadn't been factored into the projections. Another contract, one they'd thought was ending, had an option for extension that nobody had flagged properly. The numbers that had seemed so absolute, so final, weren't quite right. Or rather, they were right based on limited information, and nobody had questioned whether that information was complete. Richard sat back in his chair as dawn light started filtering through the windows. If he adjusted the projections, if he included the revenue that was actually likely to come through, the layoffs became unnecessary. Not all of them. Some of the positions eliminated were genuinely redundant, but at least half. Including Margaret's. But admitting that meant admitting the executive team had made a mistake. It meant calling an emergency meeting and explaining that their necessary cost-cutting might have been premature. It meant looking weak in front of the board, looking like he couldn't manage a simple restructuring without second-guessing himself. It meant choosing between his pride and what was right. Richard thought about his father, about that inscription on the gravestone. A man who built with his hands and led with his heart. His father had made mistakes too, plenty of them, but he'd never been afraid to admit when he was wrong. He'd never let pride override conscience. The sun was fully up now. Richard showered, dressed, and headed to the office, even though it was technically closed for the holiday. The building was empty, his footsteps echoing in the lobby. He went to his office and started making calls. First to Patricia, apologizing for the early hour but explaining they needed to meet immediately. Then to Garrett, the CFO, telling him to review the updated projections Richard was about to send. Then to the other executives, one by one, gathering them for a meeting tomorrow morning, no excuses. Have you ever faced something like this? A moment where you had to choose between admitting you were wrong and protecting your pride? Let us know in the comments. He pulled up Margaret Chen's personnel file and made a note. Recall from termination. Reinstate with back pay. Promotion to senior analyst, effective immediately. Then he started working on the others. The people whose jobs could be saved with more accurate projections and a willingness to admit that maybe, just maybe, the algorithm didn't know everything. Outside his window, the city was waking up, people starting their day, continuing their lives, unaware that in this quiet office, something fundamental was shifting. The emergency meeting started at 9 in the morning, and the room was tense from the moment everyone arrived. Garrett walked in with his jaw set, already defensive. Patricia looked confused, her folder of notes clutched tight. The other executives took their seats quietly, sensing something unusual was happening. Richard stood at the head of the table, the updated financial projections displayed on the screen behind him. He'd been awake for almost 30 hours now, running on coffee and nervous energy, and the absolute certainty that what he was about to do was right, even if it cost him everything. "Thank you for coming on short notice," he began. "I've asked you here because we made a mistake." "I made a mistake." He watched Garrett's face harden, saw Patricia's eyes widen slightly. "The layoffs we executed last week were based on incomplete financial projections. After reviewing our actual contract pipeline and renewal probabilities, I believe at least 7 of those 15 positions should not have been eliminated." Garrett leaned forward. "Richard, we all reviewed those numbers. The board signed off on the restructuring. You can't second-guess decisions after they've been implemented." "I can when they're wrong," Richard replied, keeping his voice steady. "Look at the screen. The Palmer contract renewal. We assumed it wouldn't happen because their CFO was retiring. But I called their new CFO yesterday. They're not only renewing, they're expanding their order by 30%. That's revenue we didn't account for." He clicked to the next slide. "The Harrison account. We classified it as ending, but there's a 2-year extension option that wasn't flagged in the system. I confirmed with their purchasing manager. They plan to exercise it. That's another substantial revenue stream we missed. Patricia spoke up, her voice careful. If what you're saying is accurate, then yes, it changes the math. But Richard, some of these people have already moved on. They've accepted other positions. And recalling them now, after we terminated them on Christmas Eve. She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. I know, Richard said. I know this makes us look incompetent. I know the board will question my leadership, but my father didn't build this company by being too proud to admit when he was wrong. He built it by treating people with dignity and making things right when he made mistakes. He paused, looking around the room. We told 15 people they weren't valued. We did it on Christmas Eve, and for at least 7 of them, we were wrong. So we're going to fix it. The meeting lasted 2 hours. There were arguments, concerns about precedent, warnings about how the board would react. But Richard held firm. By the end, they had a plan. Patricia would reach out to the 7 employees whose positions were being restored, offering not just their jobs back, but increased pay and a formal apology. They'd frame it as a discovery of new revenue that allowed them to reverse the decision. It wasn't the whole truth, but it preserved some dignity for everyone involved. Margaret Chen was first on the list. Richard made the call himself that afternoon. His hand shook slightly as he dialed her number, and he realized he was more nervous about this conversation than he'd been about facing the entire executive team. She answered on the 3rd ring. Hello? Margaret, this is Richard Brennan. Silence on the other end. He pushed forward. I'm calling because we made a mistake. The company's financial situation is better than we projected, and we're recalling several positions, including yours. I'd like to offer you your job back, effective immediately, with full back pay for the time you've missed, and a promotion to senior analyst. More silence. Then softly, Mr. Brennan, I don't understand. He took a breath. We were wrong to let you go. The decision was based on incomplete information, and I take full responsibility for not catching that sooner. You've been a valuable member of this company for 8 years, and if you're willing to return, we'd be grateful to have you back. He heard her breathing on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. My children, they've been so worried. They tried to help, selling cookies, and I didn't know how to tell them it would take more than cookies to fix things. I know, Richard said quietly. I saw them. I saw what they did, and it reminded me what this company is supposed to be about. Not just profit margins and efficiency metrics, but people, families. Your kids shouldn't have to worry about whether you can buy groceries, Margaret. That's on me, and I'm sorry. She was crying now, he could hear it, but she was also laughing a little. I'll come back, she said. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. After they hung up, Richard sat at his desk for a long time. 6 more calls to make, 6 more apologies to deliver. The board meeting next week would be brutal. Garrett was already drafting his objections. There would be consequences for this decision. Questions about Richard's judgment. Maybe even challenges to his position as CEO. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something his father would have been proud of. If you've been enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. Through his office window, the city continued its rhythm, and somewhere out there, Emma and Danny Chen were learning that sometimes people do the right thing. Margaret returned to work the following Monday, and the moment she walked through the doors of Brennan Industries, something shifted in the office atmosphere. People greeted her warmly, relief evident on their faces. If Margaret could come back, maybe they weren't all just numbers on a spreadsheet. Maybe this place still cared about the people who kept it running. She settled back into her cubicle, and within hours it was as if she'd never left. Except now there was a quiet confidence in her bearing, a knowledge that she'd survived the worst and come through stronger. Richard watched from his office window as she worked, as other employees stopped by her desk to welcome her back, and he felt something unfamiliar. Not pride in quarterly earnings or successful contract negotiations, but pride in having made a choice that mattered beyond the bottom line. The other 6 recalled employees returned over the following days. Not all of the 15 could be brought back. Some positions truly were redundant, and a few people had already moved on to opportunities that better suited them. But Richard met personally with each person who'd been let go, offering sincere apologies and severance packages that went beyond corporate minimum standards. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that counted for something. The board meeting was as difficult as he'd anticipated. There were pointed questions about his decision-making process, concerns about appearing indecisive, suggestions that perhaps someone younger and more aggressive should take over the CEO position. Richard listened to it all without defending himself beyond presenting the facts. The updated financial projections spoke for themselves, and when the quarter closed, the numbers proved him right. The recalled employees were needed, and the company's performance remained strong. What the board didn't see, what couldn't be captured in a quarterly report, was how the culture began to shift. Employees worked harder, stayed later, took more initiative, not because they were afraid of being fired, but because they'd seen that their leaders were willing to admit mistakes and make things right. Trust, it turned out, was worth more than efficiency metrics. On a gray afternoon in February, Richard was reviewing reports when Patricia knocked on his door. "Someone here to see you," she said, smiling in a way that suggested he should come now. In the lobby stood Margaret Chen, Emma, and Danny. The children were dressed in their school clothes, backpacks slung over their shoulders, and they looked simultaneously excited and nervous. "Mr. Brennan," Margaret said, "I hope this is okay. The kids wanted to thank you personally, and I thought it was important." Emma stepped forward first, holding a small, wrapped package. "We made you something," she said, her voice clear and steady, despite the nervousness in her eyes. "To say thank you for giving our mom her job back." Richard knelt down to be at their eye level and carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a framed photograph, not a professional one, but a picture someone had taken at the bake sale that day after Christmas. It showed Emma and Danny at their little table, the cardboard sign visible, both of them grinning despite the cold. But what made Richard's breath catch was what they'd added to the frame. Around the photo's edges, they'd glued small decorative elements, a cookie they'd preserved somehow, painted gold, Emma's careful handwriting that said "Family helps family," and at the bottom, in Danny's choppier letters, "Thank you for helping our family. We wanted you to remember," Danny said seriously, "that when you help people, it matters. Mom told us you made a really hard choice, and we think you're brave." Richard's throat felt tight. He looked at the photograph, at these kids who'd stood in the cold trying to help their mother, who'd turned their worry into action, who'd taught him more about leadership in one afternoon than he'd learned in a decade of business school. "Thank you," he managed to say. "This is the nicest gift anyone's ever given me. I'm going to put it right on my desk where I can see it every day," and he did. The photograph sat beside his computer monitor, a constant reminder that every decision he made affected real people, real families, real lives. It reminded him of what his father had understood instinctively, that a company wasn't just profit and loss statements, but a collection of human beings trusting you to care about their well-being. Margaret Chen went on to become one of the company's most valuable senior analysts, eventually heading up an entire department. Emma graduated high school with honors and earned a scholarship to college, often telling people that watching her mother fight through hard times taught her she could overcome anything. Danny grew into a teenager with his mother's determination and his sister's kindness, always the first to help when someone needed it. As for Richard Brennan, he led Brennan Industries for many more years, and under his leadership, the company became known not just for quality products, but for treating employees with dignity. He never forgot that Christmas, never forgot the lesson 2 children taught him about what truly matters. The photograph stayed on his desk until the day he retired, and in his farewell speech, he told the story of Margaret Chen and her children and a cardboard sign on a cold December afternoon. "My father built this company with his hands and led with his heart," Richard said that day, his voice steady and sure. "I lost sight of the second part for a while. But sometimes, if you're very lucky, life gives you a chance to learn what you should have known all along, that the people who work beside you aren't resources to be managed. They're human beings who deserve your respect, your honesty, and your best efforts to do right by them." If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for spending this time with us today, and may you always find the courage to choose kindness over convenience, compassion over calculation, and humanity over the bottom line. Until next time, take care of each other